So good morning, friends and colleagues. I welcome you all to this exciting neuro-ophthalmology session on a lovely Sunday morning. We have a fantastic faculty lined up here, and I thank all of you for accepting my invitation on a short notice. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Padmavati. She's a senior neuro-ophthalmologist in the Arvind Network Group of Hospitals, and her talk is going to be on evaluation of pupils. Go ahead, Padma.
Yeah, 1 minute. 1 minute, I'll share my screen.
You're able to share your screen?
1 minute, I'm not, I think. Moment.
It's not happening. You want the neurotech guy to help you?
No.
Should we start with the next speaker then, Padma?
Yeah, you go with, yeah, please. I think I'm getting delayed.
Okay, Shailaja, you want to introduce Dr. Ambika? Shailaja?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So the next speaker would be Dr. Ambika S. We all know she's a senior neuro-ophthalmologist and director of the neuro-ophthalmology department of Shankar Nethralaya. And she would be speaking about how to tackle diplopia. It's a dangerous entity. So talk is on dangerous diplopia. Ma'am, please share your screen.
Yeah. Thank you, team BOA and Himalini for this opportunity. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Right. Okay. So I think I'm going to talk on dangerous diplopias because diplopia is a very common clinical presentation in our day-to-day practice. And there are a lot of deadly ones in that. So we have to fish out which are the diplopias which have to be worried. So if you see any patient with multiple cranial nerve palsies, chronic cranial nerve palsy, which is beyond 6 weeks and no resolution signs, and acute cranial nerve palsy in young adult or in children, and a pupil involving third nerve palsy, optic neuropathy or signs of papilledema with a false localizing sign like sixth nerve palsy, painful ophthalmoplegia, and a history of trauma, and particularly any ENT surgeries. If there is any past history of malignancy or systemic diseases like demyelination, HIV, TB, and of late, COVID, you have to be very careful dealing with such diplopias because we are seeing cranial nerve palsies also following COVID infection of late. So the common etiologies which are supposed to be dangerous are the vascular entities, which are aneurysm, AV fistula, CCF, again, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. If you see a papilledema and a patient with no intracranial mass lesion, watch out for this deadly entity because again, this is on a higher rise after COVID, what we are seeing in our day-to-day practice. So giant cell arteritis, intracranial tumors, primary or secondary masses, and infection. And as Rashmin has said, this is a deadly boom of rhinocerebroorbital nucar in Indian COVID patients, particularly the uncontrolled diabetic ones. And apart from routine bacterial and viral infections, this is on a higher rise. And inflammation like Tolosa-Hunt syndrome or a post-FES or dental procedures, watch out for inflammatory signs and a diplopia. So a detailed history taking is the key in any neuro-ophthalmic entity, and so is diplopia. So find out what is the way it started. So the onset of diplopia, how much it is progressive, or is it showing some signs of resolution by the time the patient comes to you? And is there any variability? Is it painful or painless? And associated symptoms like headache, fever, and vision loss. Watch out for an infection or an inflammation, particularly when a patient is post-COVID and or even TB, diabetes, zoster infections, or HIV. Watch out for this headache, fever, and with or without vision loss, a patient coming with diplopia. Is it recurrent? Is there any past history of malignancy, trauma, or surgery, as I had already mentioned? So do a detailed evaluation clinically for detailed optic nerve function assessment, anterior and posterior segment evaluation, and then go to the extraocular motility assessment. I'm not going into the details of it. Do a brief lid, orbital and periorbital changes swatch, and then go for this optic nerve function further assessment like visual fields or OCT if there is any associated optic neuropathy. So what are the investigations you would go for? A detailed blood workup starting from a basic hemogram. There are many times where patients have come with a cranial nerve palsy and we have picked up myeloproliferative disorders. So blood sugar assessment, ESR and CRP, and this can be very useful in an elderly coming with a diplopia, and be always suspicious of giant cell arteritis because even that can cause a cranial nerve palsy. And granulomatous conditions like TB, sarcoid and IgG4 and HIV and zoster as and when required. Again, HRCT to rule out TB and now COVID. So autoimmune panel, thyroid profile, and then a myasthenia workup as and when required. So if you're going to plan for a LP, ask for the CSF opening pressure because many times it's been missed, and also a detailed CSF analysis. Coming to the neuroimaging in diplopia, definitely MRI plays a key imaging choice, and particularly the contrast enhanced MRI, which is a thin 3 millimeter cuts with required inversion recovery and path suppression techniques, is the imaging modality of choice. But there is definitely a role of CT brain and orbit in few exceptions like trauma, metallic foreign body, TD, and in MRI contraindications with pacemakers, metallic implants, and particularly if you're dealing with a claustrophobic guy. But also ask for a PET CT if you have a malignancy of known or unknown etiology. So if you come across a diplopia with multiple cranial nerve palsy, the most common combination what we see is 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you see 3, 4, V1 and 6, it is the level of lesion is superior orbital fissure. If the vision is involved, it's going to be orbital apex. And if V2 is involved, it's a cavernous sinus syndrome. Localization is very important, but definitely I could say that if a lesion starts in any one particular area of this, will sooner go with a few days to the rest of the anatomical zones because they are not miles apart. So this is a key great mimicker, oculomyasthenia gravis. Any patient coming with a diplopia, do not get carried away with the multiple movement restrictions. Always watch for this. This is a case which had a clear improvement post eyes, and this is pre and post Tensilon. So watch out for that also. If you have an isolated or multiple cranial nerve palsy, which is more dangerous, let me put it that either of it could be. So not always an isolated cranial nerve palsy can be benign. So now you will start seeing few case examples. So this is a 9-year-old girl who presented with an acute EZO. She could see that there is a cross left abduction restriction and abduction restriction with a left ESO and a face turn. On imaging, she had a well-defined hypointense lesion in the left half of the pons, which was partly cystic and necrotic. And this was nothing but a dangerous pilocytic astrocytoma, which presented with a nuclear isolated left 6 nerve palsy. So this is a 56-year-old gentleman with a diabetes and hypertension with a headache and diplopia. There was a classical right 3rd nerve palsy, which was pupil involving. So do not settle down only with MRI, proceed, ask for an MRA, which picked this small outpouching, small right PCOM aneurysm, which you can see over here. And in case of this case, it was a chronic left 6 nerve palsy. She was a hypertensive female. She was almost sitting for 3 years with this particular problem, and her previous imagings were negative. So we went ahead, repeated her imaging, and this thin cut at the level, this is a coronal MR cut, which you could pick up a cavern at the level of the cavernous and sphenoids, and it's a large flow voice signal, which is nothing but a left ICA aneurysm, which was compressing over there. So if you see some vascular lesions, ask for an angiogram. So this angiogram also picked a left ICA aneurysm. In addition, it also picked up a right side quiet aneurysm, which is again sitting along the right ICA. So this is one thing which you have to be careful about. This is a 10-year-old boy who came with a history of injurious stick. He started with diplopia, but subsequently within few days, he had a severe ptosis and a frozen globe. His right eye almost became totally froze with a complete loss of vision. And on imaging, he had a well-defined lesion, which is sitting almost in the posterior orbital apex to the SOF and the cavernous sinus. You can see the lesion. Not only there was an ill-defined soft tissue, there was also a linear tissue like a hypointense signal, which was nothing but the broken wooden stick, which was sticking into the apex and causing a infarctive cavernous sinus thrombosis. And this is the classical presentation of a diabetic coming with a post-dental problem. He had a headache, toothache, and subsequently he began with diplopia, but very soon he went in for no perception of light. Again, a complete ophthalmoplegia of the right, and he had a central retinal artery occlusion within few days. And that guy also had a right optic nerve diffuse thickening with an SOF lesion as well as the cavernous sinus. So this was again a case of cavernous sinus thrombosis. And this is not something unusual what we see. This guy is post-FES procedure. He developed this completely red and frozen globe. And the FES washings showed that he grew aspergillus. But he had this diffuse lesion again sitting from the optic nerve to the right cavernous sinus, which very well responded to the antifungal therapy. And this is the post-treatment, what you can see the resolution of the lesion. But this is not the case what we see in this severe infection, what we are seeing in COVID patients, where patients come with acute headache and periorbital pain, even after recovering with COVID. And this is one of our own patients. She was an uncontrolled diabetic and immunocompromised. She settled down from COVID and she came back. But this is her imaging. There's a diffuse thickening of her left optic nerve, again in the left cavernous sinus. You can see there's all these nasal cavity and the sinuses are filled with ill-defined soft tissue lesion. In fact, you can see this maxillary area with a fluid level and an erosion over the bones, which is classical for the mucor. So that patient is not doing that well, I guess. That's what I heard last from her. And it is not only this sort of bad escharring and severe toxic signs, and most of the times patients do not respond to the antifungal therapy and radical surgeries and they succumb to it. This is a 60-plus-year-old female who came with a binocular diplopia of 1 month duration with headache, and she was an uncontrolled diabetic. So if you have a diabetic, do not think it's only a vascular cause. If you see some history like this, when you see any malignancy, she was having a uterine malignancy. So we went ahead and imaged, and this is her MRI finding. She had an extensive metastasis throughout the cerebellum. In fact, she also had a mild fourth ventricular compression, which is deadly for her. So this was a case of intracranial metastasis presenting with a left sixth nerve palsy. So this is one patient who was referred to us as thyroid eye disease with diplopia. This 40-ish female came with, she was diagnosed as with lid signs, and there was also a mild drop in vision in the right eye. If you could see, there is a lid lag on down gaze, there is a retraction in this gaze. Actually, she was having a right partial third nerve palsy with the signs of aberrant regeneration. This is what you are seeing over here. And the patient was diagnosed as thyroid eye disease with a normal CT. Actually, you don't have to settle down with CT orbit over here. She needed more imaging, which was not covered, unfortunately. She had a dropped vision with a poor color vision, and fields made the diagnosis much easier. You could see an dense advanced right temporal defect also in the left side. So that was a bitemporal effect, again pointing out to this massive lesion sitting over here. Her orbit cuts did only up to this. So if you would have just gone beyond, you would have made the diagnosis earlier itself. So this MRI and brain and orbit showed a huge right cellular supracellular mass lesion, and post-transsphenoidal surgery, this is her visual fields. So she started recovering in the vision as well as her visual fields, and also started recovering. So to conclude, diplopia with dilate pupil, pain, proptosis, ptosis, and poor vision could be deadly. Do a detailed neuroophthalmic evaluation with a history taking. And neuroimaging of choice is definitely a contrast-enhanced MRI brain and orbit. Always guide your radiologist what you're looking for, and also help them to localize and go more in their sectioning at the level what you are trying to expect the lesion could be. Otherwise, you're going to get a report saying that correlate clinically, which many a times we all end up having with. So although CT has a limited role, it doesn't apply for cranial nerve palsy. Localize the diplopia, the cause, systemic, neurologic, or orbital. And not all isolated cranial nerve palsies are benign. Remember that. And history of malignancy needs extensive evaluation and imaging. Multiple cranial nerve palsies are always associated with deadly causes, and prompt management can be life-saving. Thank you and stay safe, all of you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a wonderful lecture, very interesting collection of cases. I was just wondering, what was the result of that patient with a wooden foreign body going right up to the apex?
We advised him for a surgical excision, but that guy refused and he lost follow-up to us.
Oh, yeah, it was indeed an interesting case. Just a question to all of the speakers here is, do you order a COVID RT-PCR test in all patients presenting with cranial nerve palsies in this current scenario of the pandemic? Ambika can answer first.
I don't think, unless if the patient comes up with a history or any other symptoms, because I think by now we all are asymptomatic in one form and we may be having antibodies. So I don't specifically ask for that antibody or PCR or HRCT unless the patient has a probable positive history of a COVID or a family member having a COVID and he developing these features.
If you cannot explain why patient has developed a cranial nerve palsy, like say a very young guy, no vasculopathic risk factors, and suddenly it comes with a 6th nerve palsy, MRI is normal, is where otherwise, as Ambika said, I don't think a routine RT-PCR is warranted at the moment.
Okay. Anyone else would like to comment on that?
Ambika, is there a changed protocol for third nerve palsies? Like previously we used to do an MRI angio only if it was a pupil involving palsy, but would you say that the trend has changed, that every third nerve palsy is an emergency and should be neuroimaged with MRI along with an angio?
See, if
irrespective of the pupil?
No. If the patient is going to be a complete third nerve palsy, pupil sparing, I prefer to wait. And if the patient is having vascular risk factors, you can afford to wait. If it is a partial third nerve palsy, even if it's a pupil sparing, I may advise for imaging. If it's a pupil involving palsy, default, I would image. And if there is a flow void or any changes on the imaging where we suspect a vascular lesion, we would go ahead and do an MR angiogram.
Thank you. I think Padma's ready, Shailaja, with her.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Padma.
Okay, sorry for the glitch. Okay, good afternoon. At the outset, my screen is visible?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Please make it full screen, ma'am.
Yeah, I have put it full screen.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Hemalini, for giving me this opportunity at a short notice. Evaluation of the pupil. This is an integral part, not only in neuro-ophthalmology, but also in general ophthalmology. If you see, this is a small circular aperture in the iris diaphragm, which regulates the light passage. You have two participants. One is the sphincter pupillae and the dilator pupillae, which have a telltale on the size of the pupil. So when you see any pupil, you have to observe the size and measure it in bright and dim illumination. Any asymmetry also has to be assessed. So the pupillary reflexes are mainly your light reflex, your swinging flashlight test, and your near response. So when you shine a torch, the direct response is your constriction of the pupil. The consensual also you get a constriction of the pupil. The swinging flashlight test is an extension of where you compare the direct and consensual reaction of both the eyes. That is, it is a measure of the optic nerve function of both the eyes. The pupil size is always determined by the age, the level of retinal illumination, emotional factors, as well as the amount of accommodation or convergence. If you see any abnormal shapes, you have all other evidence where you have a history of trauma associated with subconjunctival hemorrhage, as well as a sphincter tear, which is a traumatic mydriasis. This is a case of iododialysis. This is an iris coloboma, or it could be a post-herpetic infection. The symptomatology in all these cases is the patient usually complains of blurred vision, they have a photophobia or a difficulty in near vision or difficulty in dark and light adaptation. Whenever you have a pupil abnormality, these are the factors which are the cofactors. One is the lids, the extraocular movements, the visual acuity, and associated symptom of headache, which will give you a roadmap to the diagnosis of the condition. So this is a basic of the pupillary reflex. When you shine a torch, you have the pupillary fibers going on, going via the optic nerve, crossing and decussating at the chiasma via the optic tract to the pretectal area. This constitutes the afferent arc. When you have a lesion involving this path, you have either a total afferent pupillary defect or a relative afferent pupillary defect or a vernix hemianopic pupil when you have the optic tract which is involved. If you see the central path, you have the fibers coming from the pretectal nucleus to the ipsilateral as well as the contralateral. So any lesion in this will give you a pretectal RAPD with normal vision and normal field. The afferent arc is from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus to the ciliary ganglion to the pupillary sphincter. So any lesion in the afferent pathway is associated with anisocoria. You have a difference in the pupil size. So as I said, the abnormal pupil, you could have the afferent pathway defects or the afferent pathway defects or the sympathetic pathway defects. Moving on to my first case, this is a 32-year-old male who had a history of trauma. He had a RTA. If you can see, he has a subconjunctival hemorrhage, laceration over the eyebrow. If you see the slit lamp evaluation of the pupil on the left eye, you have a bright reflex. And if you see on the other side, you have a grade 3 RAPD. So what is the significance of RAPD? It always indicates an optic neuropathy, which is unilateral or asymmetric involvement of the optic nerve. There is always no anisocoria in relative afferent pupillary defect. This actually has a better correlation with the visual field rather than the visual acuity. This can also be seen even in one functioning pupil. If you see in this eye, the left eye pupil is abnormal. If you shine on the right eye, you will have a normal light reaction. But if you swing to the other side, you will see an escape which will indicate a optic neuropathy in the left eye. So what is anisocoria? That is unequal pupils of more than 2 millimeters. As I said, you have to observe in bright and dim illumination. The question is, the smaller pupil is abnormal or the larger pupil is abnormal? So the small pupil is abnormal when the light reaction is normal and good, but there is poor dilatation in dark. Whereas the large pupil is abnormal when the light reaction is poor in one eye and evident in bright light. So when you have an abnormal large pupil, the differential diagnosis goes in favor of a pupil involving third nerve palsy, Addis pupil, traumatic mydriasis, and any pharmacologically dilated pupil. So this was one patient who had a pupil involving third nerve palsy. If you can see here, this pupil is almost dilated. And this is another case where she had an IC aneurysm, which was the cause of the pupil involving third nerve palsy. This helps in detection of aneurysm and also treatment prior to rupture. So the mortality associated with these conditions is 30%. This patient had a dilated pupil. He was comatose. He had a history of injury, and it was a pupil involving third nerve palsy. A progressive pupillary dilatation in a case of comatose patient, it is always necessitates a neurosurgical attention. So this patient had a hematoma which was causing the uncal herniation, and this was the cause of the Hutchinson pupil. This is another female who had blurred vision in right eye. Her visual acuity was 6.6 in the right eye, but however, her near vision was N12. If you can see here, she had a dilated pupil, and if you can appreciate, there are slight vermiform movements in this eye, which is characteristic of Addis pupil. So this is a dilated pupil. If you shine the touch, the consensual is in this. If you see the reaction in the other eye, it is good. And the pupil constricts on near accommodation, saying that this is a case of light near dissociation. So here, over time, you have a recovery of the accommodation, the pupillary light reaction worsens. Suppose you have an affection of the deep tendon reflexes, it is hyporeflexic. In the long-standing cases of Addis people, they become smaller as well as irregular. Argyll-Robertson pupil is also a small irregular pupil where you have a lesion in the pretectal area and rostral area of the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. You have the accommodation reflex present and the pupillary reflex absent. So light near dissociation of pupil, it encompasses multiple conditions. One is the dorsal midbrain lesion where you have the posterior commissure which is affected, or you have when you have a loss of pretectal input to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, or it could be an Addis pupil, or it could be aberrant third nerve regeneration, or it could be any systemic association like diabetes, syphilis, etc. Moving on to the abnormal small pupil, you have a poor dilatation in dim light. The differential diagnosis mostly is the Horner syndrome, or it could be due to pharmacological usage of pilocarpine, or it could be post-uveitic. If you see, this is the pathway for the sympathetic, where from the fibers come from the hypothalamus to the ciliospinal center of Brugge to the superior cervical ganglion to the dilator pupil muscle. So if you have a lesion in the hypothalamus to the ciliospinal center of Brugge, you call this as a central Horner syndrome. Before the ganglion, it is the preganglionic lesion, and if you have any ICA dissection, it is a postganglionic lesion. So this was a 43-year-old male who had a slight ptosis in the one eye. If you can see, there is a ptosis. And this was a case of Horner syndrome where he had a meiosis in the left eye. He had apparent enophthalmos also. The classical finding in these cases is a pupillary dilatation lag where associated with a loss of ciliospinal reflex. And this
sorry to interrupt, ma'am. Another minute more.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'll wind up. Pancoast tumor was there in this case. Sorry, the slide is not moving. Any Horner syndrome, to diagnose a Horner syndrome, the pharmacological and this is a case of postganglionic Horner syndrome. I think. Okay. So when you have a normal light reaction with a, I think my video has gone. I'm sorry for the. I think.
Ma'am, can you go back to the slideshow? Are you not able to do that?
No, I think it has stopped. That is what. Yes, 1 minute. I'll go back to the slide. My connectivity is a bit slow. That is the reason why it is not processing.
Dr. Padmavati, you want to summarize your talk just like extempore?
Okay, yeah. Whenever you have an abnormal size in the pupils, you think of an afferent pathway. When you have a lesion, when the normal afferent defect is there, you always have to assess the light reaction, which could always give you a clue. I'll just put the end slide to summarize.
Ma'am, we cannot see your slides.
1 minute. I'm sharing it only.
Yeah, it's just showing your desktop, but not your folder.
Yeah,
but not.
now it is okay. I think, is it visible now?
No, it is just
It's
showing
not.
on screen. The PPT is not open to mouth.
Now, is it visible?
No, ma'am.
I'm able to see,
Can you-
but I,
Yeah,
Padma, you just summarize
Okay.
your last slide extempo, and then we'll go on to the next speaker.
okay. Thank you. And sorry for this glitch, okay, technical glitch.
Happens.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you, Dr.
much
Padma.
for giving me this opportunity.
Will you stop your screen share so I can, so Sharja can invite the next speaker, please?
Yeah. Okay. Is this visible?
no, ma'am.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
Yeah. So sorry about that glitch. So our next speaker again needs no introduction. Dr. Rashmin Gandhi, who's a consultant at the Center for Sight. He has been teaching us neuro-ophthalmology in a very interesting way and moving on from the afferent pathway, speaking on the efferent pathway and the neurological aspects of ptosis. Over to you, Dr. Gandhi.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Lahane, Dr. Ragini Parekh, Swapnesh, Himalini, Preetham, and the entire BOA MOS committee for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I would request also to let me know when I exceed the time. So today we're going to discuss about the neurological aspects of ptosis. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is already covered by Ambika and Padmavati, and I'll just dwell into the relevant points about this. Now, why would you like to rule out or make sure that you're not dealing with the neurological aspect of ptosis? And this is the prime example. Here is a patient who came with the ptosis. This is preoperative. You see, it was an adult onset, acute onset ptosis. You see, this is how it looked like before surgery. Went somewhere, the surgery was done, and post-operatively, ptosis is still persisting because he had something else going on and not the apparent ptosis. Now he has developed some amount of exposure in the down gaze. So it's very important before we embark on the management or a surgical management process to make sure that we are not dealing with a neurological aspect of ptosis. Basically, I'm going to focus on three things: myopathies or ptosis which develops because of problem with the muscle, nerve-related ptosis, and myasthenia. Myasthenia, I'll just touch upon it because I know Murli is going to cover it in detail in his talk. So if the patient presents like this, a 70-year-old gentleman, musculopathic risk factors, complete ptosis, exotropia on the primary gaze, no adduction when he looks to his left, abduction is normal, looks up and down, and we saw some of these examples in Ambika's and Padmavati's cases. So this is a clear example of a right third nerve palsy. What is it? If you deal with this kind of patient, obviously there is no confusion, but what is it that you look for if you're dealing with the problem of a third nerve palsy? One, look at the pupil. Second, look at the other nerves, especially fourth nerve and the other nerves, as Ambika also mentioned. And the next one is look for aberrant regeneration. Here is an example of another case of a ptosis. There is a ptosis of the right side, and when the ocular motility is being checked, you will find that the pupil of the right side is also dilated. So there is a ptosis, there is an isochoria with right pupil being larger than the left, and you'll find that patient has a limitation of elevation. So in effect, patient has a partial third nerve palsy, which presented with ptosis and also has a pupillary involvement. As Ambika mentioned, these patients require an urgent attention, and the investigation of choice would be MRI brain in orbit with or without angiography, because you're suspecting that patient has a compressive lesion of the third nerve, and one of the commonest compressive lesion of the third nerve would be aneurysm of the posterior communicating artery. Another feature of a ptosis you need to look for, again, Ambika covered it partly in her talk. You see here, patient has a third nerve palsy, recovered, has a partial ptosis here, but when the ocular motility is being checked, you find here that there is an enlargement of palpebral fissure when the patient is adducting that eye, also called inverse Duane syndrome. And you'll find here that when patient looks down, patient would have reduction of ptosis or a lid lag, also called pseudo-Van Graaffel sign, very clear. So this patient has an aberrant regeneration of third nerve. Why this is important? This is exactly like involvement of pupil. The reason being aberrant regeneration of third nerve is almost never seen in an ischemic third nerve palsy. So if this patient had presented to you and if he was not investigated before this particular thing warrants further investigation. Investigation being MRI, brain and orbit with angiography. So in other words, third nerve palsy, ptosis, anisocoria, aberrant regeneration, and other nerves is what you look for. Why we are worried about pupil and the aberrant regeneration? Because they might be harboring aneurysm. As Padma told, 50% of these patients who have aneurysm can rupture and die within a month. In fact, 10% can die before even they get to a medical attention. And remaining survivors, more than half of them would have permanent residual neurological effects. So person who came to your OPD either can have a fatality or can have a morbidity which is lifelong. So what is the rule of pupil? A complete third nerve palsy without pupillary involvement, your index of suspicion for a compressive lesion is very low. Otherwise, a partial third nerve palsy or involvement of pupil, your index of suspicion for compressive lesion is very high and patient requires a suitable investigation. Moving on, again, partly covered by Padmavati, a mild ptosis, and you find here that patient has an anisocoria, which is worse in a dim light. You see bright light, the pupillary size seems quite equal, but in a dim light, it is a little more. This patient was shared with me by Dr. Devendra Venkatramani from Mumbai. You suspect Horner syndrome. So any adult onset, mild ptosis, always look at the pupil. You might be dealing with acute onset Horner's. Why this is important? If patient has a painful Horner syndrome, it can be emergency. If the pain is near the temple or near the head, pain can be in the neck. If pain is in the neck, you're probably dealing with the apical lesion of the lung. If the pain is in the neck and in the head, it can be even dissection of larger vessel, which can come to you with acute onset Horner syndrome with pain. We change track, 70-year-old female with a bilateral ptosis. You can see here that there is a symmetrical ptosis. This patient, we checked for fatigability, and fatigability was positive. So another aspect of ptosis that you may deal with, which sometimes become difficult to differentiate in this age group from eponymic ptosis, is myasthenia gravis. So look for fatigability, look for Cogan's lid twitch, ask the patient to look down and make an upward saccade. After 20 seconds of a down gaze, you'll find that the lid goes up before it settles down. So this patient, after some rest, you find that the ptosis has decreased. A similar kind of patient, this patient was diagnosed as having congenital ptosis, but if you see here, the lid crease is visible. So when lid crease is visible, but the history is not really suggestive, you again go back and see, can it be something else but not a congenital ptosis? This patient underwent ICE test and the ptosis improved completely. Now, a word about ICE test, partly covered by Ambika. It is highly specific and sensitive, but you have to make sure that it does not work so well in complete ptosis. So somebody has a complete ptosis, you're suspecting myasthenia, you perform ICE test. Even if it's negative, you should go ahead and work up the patient because ICE test reliability goes down if the patient comes to you with a complete ptosis. What about the other investigations? The antibodies, again, you have to remember in a pure ocular form of myasthenia, the presence of antibodies in the blood can be only in 30 to 50% of the patient. So if it's present, it helps you. If it's absent, you still go ahead and treat the patient as myasthenia. Another patient, 32-year-old female, not able to move her eyes. You find here again bilaterally symmetrical ptosis. Her ocular motility was fine, but when she moved her eye, there was a little lid hopping, which tells you that probably patient has not really a congenital or eponymic ptosis, but something else was going on. Example of bilateral symmetrical ptosis. You find here that patient is not able to move her eyes at all. We are asking the patient to look up, down, right, and left, but the eyes are not moving. This was a patient who was diagnosed as having CPO. A word about CPO, look at the fundus, rule out pigmentary retinopathy. Also, refer the patient to a cardiologist because these patients are more susceptible to develop heart problems. Another example of bilateral symmetrical ptosis, again, this patient had a CPEO. A pharmacological test, Ambika and Padmavati mentioned about it. You have to remember that a lot of these, especially tensilon, is not freely available. Prostaglandin works very well. It's a long-lasting drug. It works very well if the patient has predominantly ocular motility problem, while tensilon works very well if the patient has ptosis as a presenting feature of ocular myasthenia. Last case, 74-year-old gentleman. My video is not playing, but wanted to highlight this patient, that this patient actually came with the complaints of drooping of eyelid, but what he really had was oculomotor apraxia or a lid apraxia, where once the lid drooped, it took little time before he could open the eyelid. Patient had Parkinsonism. You can see lid apraxia or oculomotor apraxia in Parkinsonism. This patient, a similar patient, Ambika had shown, patient has ptosis. You lift the eyelid up and you check the oculomotility, you find that all motility in all direction is limited. So this patient either can be having an orbital apex lesion or a cavernous sinus lesion, and the chart beautifully was demonstrated by Ambika in her presentation. So in other words, to conclude, you have to suspect a neurological aspect of ptosis in all adult onset ptosis, especially when there is no clear-cut history or when you cannot explain why the patient should be having a ptosis. When you see this, when you suspect a neurological aspect of ptosis, look at the movement of the lid when you check the oculomotility. Is there a lid lag? Is there a flapping? Is there a hopping of the lid? All that point towards something else going on. And as I had seen in one of the presentations which Dr. K. Ramesh made, when you have these patients, always look at the pupil and motility. Pupil, larger pupil, you are looking at a parasympathetic lesion or a third nerve. Smaller pupil on the affected side, you're looking probably at a Horner syndrome, and motility also will give you a clue. I again thank the BOA team for inviting me here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi, for that crisp talk and ending on time. We have our next speaker, Dr. Ramesh Kekunia, who would be now shifting to the optic nerve disorders. He will be speaking on approach to optic disc pallor. He's the head of the Child Sight Institute, L.V. Prasad Eye Institute, Hyderabad. Over to you, Dr. Ramesh.
Thank you so much, Shailja, and I would like to thank Dr. Hemalini as well as the BOA team for this invitation. I'm happy to speak on approach to optic disc pallor. Generally, optic disc pallor needs a lot of investigation, like reading a novel, some kind of detective novel, because any kind of acute things like proptosis, pain, disc edema, they will come to you like a zip to the hospital, either an ophthalmologist or a neurologist or a neuro-ophthalmologist. But pallor is a little bit dry thing we need to really look into. Having said that, there are different causes for optic discs. Clinically, if you see, generally we classify them as primary, secondary, consecutive, as well as glaucomatous. Glaucoma, I think purely it's a neuro-ophthalmology department actually, but we separate ourselves thinking that, okay, glaucoma is different. And somehow patients self-triage themselves so that they come, the other disc pallor come to us, but sometimes we have a combination of glaucoma as well as neurological. This is about classification. Now, this is the most important aspect of my presentation, I would say. Whenever you see the pallor, grade them, whether it is differential pallor, superior or inferior, what is the color, contour, and cupping? These are the three things we need to see with regards to the optic disc per se. With regards to other things, I would give importance to vessels emerging from the optic disc. What are their, whether there is any gliotic changes, peripapillary area, how is it? Whether there is any atrophy, any pigmentation, how is the peripapillary NFL? That really gives me a lot of idea. But as a comprehensive ophthalmologist, don't forget two more things. One is background retina. You will have a RP and you will be detecting it. What is the cause? Is it a pituitary tumor? But actually it's a consecutive optic atrophy secondary to retinal dystrophy. So background retina. And the sixth one does not, usually most of the textbook don't talk about it. Whether, with what media you're looking at. Does the patient have cataract? Are you looking through a aphakia? Are you looking through a pseudophakic lens? Or do you have a filter in your slit lamp or indirect? Whether there is a red-green, so that you can see this sometimes as you can even misdiagnose. That's what I was saying. Look at the color, contour, cupping. Look at this primary. Look at this secondary. Look at the vascular changes, what's happening around that. Look at this peripapillary area. Immediately, I know that I am not dealing with the primary here. This is secondary. Secondary to tumor, secondary to NAION, secondary to GCA. I'll have to figure out. That's the first thing. Look at this background retina. There are other problems here. And of course, when it comes to glaucoma, most of us are very comfortable looking at the NRR as well as the neuroretinal ring. We also have to depend on ancillary tests. They are most important. If you ask me one important test in the patient with optic atrophy, it is visual field. That's the most useful test than anything else in optic atrophy. We can detect bitemporal, homonymous, heteronymous, central scotoma, altitudinal, superior or sectoral or quadrantanopia. That really tells us. That's the next step. One is the appearance, one is the visual field. And of course, always combine them with history. With this, I guess, I think most of the panel will agree that 70 to 80% or close to 90% of the diagnosis can be made with history, appearance of the optic disc, and the visual field. And we do have other toys like OCT. They are really useful, but it cannot really guide us to say that, okay, this is consecutive, this is because of the pituitary tumor. Difficult, but you can correlate sometimes in these type of cases. Electroretinography, there are specific roles, especially looking at negative waves in CRAO, CRVO, but they are all complementary. I would not say that based on ERG or VAP, I can make a diagnosis of optic atrophy. Imaging, obviously, you can see the chiasmal tumor here. You can see the thin optic nerves on both sides. You can also see a hyperintensity old optic neuritis, which is causing optic atrophy. It's possible. CT scan, especially in traumatic cases, looking at the optic canal, any kind of compression, fractures, impingement is useful. Other investigations are really, one is diagnosing them, one is looking at the neurological causes. So blood glucose, vitamin B12, I think plays a very important role in the primary optic atrophy. So this is what I would say. There are some mimickers as well, like large disc, myopic disc, sometimes disc hypoplasia. You can really say that it's optic disc atrophy, dispate, colobomas. But I would like everyone to read about this major review by Shirisha and Virender and all. Look at this. The first row is completely glaucomatous. The second row is completely neurological. Look at this pattern. With this, you can really make out. Look at the RNFL, look at the optic disc contour, cup, and thinning. And also see the last picture here. This is causing a sectoral defect there. So here you can see that RNFL defect. So with this, like for example, in this case, you can see that there is a coloboma here. In the second case I've shared here, there is a big optic disc pit causing a peripapillary serous detachment or so. The third picture, the C on the picture is morning glory syndrome. And AB on the lower panel is because of the status post BRVO. You can see that area, especially on the black and white picture. These are the subtle things you need to look at when you are really looking at optic disc atrophy. This is one more pediatric age group patient where there is a kind of similar defect with the optic atrophy. You can see that this is because of HIE or hypoxic retina encephalopathy. And look at this, sometimes Dusen also can look at it. The first picture on the upper panel, and you see the second picture, bitemporal pallor. For the temporal pallor, generally there are 4 differential diagnoses, which I'll come to it later. Look at this, the upper picture, superior sectoral defect. The visual field also says the same thing. MGCL as well as RNFL also tells the same thing. This is the status post ischemic optic neuropathy. And the lower one is a megalopapilla, very large size disc. And here it's very, very, very clear. There is a pallor on both sides, mainly on the left side. This is what I said, appearance and the visual fields and the history can give away the diagnosis in most of the cases. This is one of the last, I would say, the most important slide, various shades of gray. Asymmetric temporal pallor, which I showed at this point of time, generally tells that it is chiasmal. If you see diffuse pallor with vascular changes and gliotic changes there, generally it is post-vascular occlusion, or sometimes it can be ischemic. When I say occlusion, it can be CR vivo, CR AO, ophthalmic artery occlusion, or non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy. When it is, because of chronic elevated ICP, you will see gliotic changes as well as peripapillary changes, as you see here. Obviously, background retina, we discussed, it leads to consecutive optic atrophy. And the last one, I wanted to come to it last. If you see a bitemporal pallor or a temporal pallor, there are 4 common differential diagnoses. On the top of the list, it's nutritional. Then I will say toxic. Then I will say hereditary. For these 3 things, I think the history becomes very important. With that, you will come to know which group it is. And rarely, it can be because of post-neuritic. And the last slide, never forget to look at the face, dysmorphism, examine family as and when it is required, look at the ocular and systemic association, and obviously the neuroimaging finding. I just gave one example here. This patient has optic atrophy. You know by looking at the face that this is a case of craniosynostosis. This patient has optic atrophy. Never miss that. This patient has frequent fracture. This patient has osteopetrosis. These ancillary findings. This patient has bilateral optic atrophy. Along with that, there are retinal changes. When you do imaging, there are tram track calcification. 99% of the time, it is neurofibromatosis. You have to check for glioma in this kind. So never forget any one of this. Then including history, optic disc appearance, and visual field, you can come to a diagnosis of this group of optic nerve disorders. Thank you so much for calling me and inviting me to and allowing me to speak on this optic disc pallor. I'm very happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you so much. Shailaja is troubling you. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Ramesh, we're taking questions at the end, so we'll have Dr. Jyoti Mitalia. Dr. Shailaja, invite Dr. Jyoti.
Yeah, so Dr. Jyoti, she's the head of...
I think, okay. Dr. Jyoti.
Approach. Is she here?
Yeah, she's
Yeah,
here.
Yeah. Please start share screen, ma'am.
Yes, I'll just do that. So at the outset, I'd like to thank BOA team and especially Dr. Himalini to have given me this opportunity to present. And I'd like to congratulate Himalini. You have a terrific sessions lined up for today. And I think very good talks. So congratulations. Can you all see my slide?
Not yet.
Okay, just a minute. I forgot to share it. Yeah. Okay, so now is that seen?
Yeah, visible.
Yes, okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking on bilateral disc edema, case-based approach. So when we see a bilateral disc edemas like this or something like this, the first question is this papilledema? Because usually that's what patients present with. But most importantly, we have to ask, is this optic neuropathy? For which, importantly, let's check the vision and see if there's a vision loss, which helps us to classify them into no visual loss and visual loss. And then if no visual loss, we look at these. So let me take you through cases and try to explain each of them. Before we go on, like for example, this patient presented both eyes disc similar for a routine checkup. Vision was 6/6. But before we go on, let's understand whether this is true disc edema. And that's very, very important for us to then classify them into bilateral or not. So when you have, so if there's an elevation here, you can see it's confined to the disc.
The disc vasculature is visible at the margins. There is no venous congestion, and the peripapillary reflex is crisp and it's crescentic, as you can see, without any exudate. So this is actually a pseudoedema. So this patient, we got a B scan done, which shows the calcific proteinaceous material confirmed by a high spike on A scan and confirmed by a CT scan. And fundus autofluorescence will also show this appearance, confirming that this is disc drusen. So before we investigate him into finding out what could be the neurological or other causes, rule out a disc drusen by a simple tool that we have is the B scan. So let's then understand what do you mean by true disc edema. An elevation which is extending into the peripapillary retina as shown, with a graying and mudding of the peripapillary nerve fiber layer, obscuration of the vessels at the margin is a true disc edema. Now let's go to the other causes of no visual loss. Yes, hypertensive retinopathy, as you can see. So very, very important in your clinic, get a BP done for any patient who has bilateral disc edemas. Interestingly, these patients will not have significant venous congestion and elevation that you see in case of papilledema. You will find them arteriolar attenuation. So look for those signs. That is in grade 4. Malignant hypertension, on the other hand, will have significant loss of vision. So that comes in the other category, which is basically grade 4 with macular edema, and look for secondary causes and treat accordingly. Now coming to the next, that is the visual loss, and we'll classify them as papilledema, the hereditary, the vascular, demyelinating, infectious, inflammatory, and the other categories. So what is papilledema? It's swelling of the optic nerve head secondary to the raised ICP, which is non-inflammatory and passive. It's bilateral, but you could also get asymmetric. And when that is absent, then we call this as optic disc edema. So what are the causes of raised ICP? You would have a mass effect. So you look for any tumors. It could be obstruction of the ventricular system in congenital cases or a shunt failure. It could be idiopathic intracranial hypertension. So look for the drugs or any of these associations, you have to investigate for them. You could look for impairment of CSF absorption via arachnoid villi, that is meningitis, as seen here, or it could be subarachnoid hemorrhage. Look for diffuse cerebral edema secondary to blunt trauma, and finally severe systemic hypertension. Now, in case of early papilledema, like this patient who presented with 6/6 vision, all you found was just an elevation around. So remember that the vision tends to be normal. You just have a subtle elevation. But in case of established papilledema, you would have normal to reduced vision, but significant hyperemia with a lot of cottonwool spots and patterns lines which are seen. Here, the vision was normal in this patient, but visual field will start so early changes. Like, for example, you'll have inferior nasal step that is seen in the early stages. But as the papilledema starts getting chronic, you'll start seeing the patterns lines. You can also have this optociliary shunts, which are seen, indicating that the chronicity is increasing and the field effects worsen. There is constriction and vision may get affected in one eye. And in those cases, the vision can drop and you may develop an RAPT there. In case of atrophic papilledema, on the other hand, you will have significant vision impairment. The central vision gets affected, so vision tends to drop. And you will find that even the constriction of vision fields is significant. So how do you treat them? Yes, investigate, do a B scan to rule out the fluid, image the patient and visual fields. The non-ocular plan, as I said, record BP, you get a neurological evaluation. Most important, the CSF opening pressure needs to be done. Treatment would depend on what the cause is. Address it first, medically and surgically. Medically, if it's IIH, treat with orals, acetazolamide, salt-restricted diet, and weight loss, very, very important. Don't disregard it, minimum 10% needed. But in case of cerebral venous thrombosis, oral anticoagulants to be used. Surgically, if there's a tumor, neurosurgical intervention. If it's purely IIH and vision is threatened, then you do an optic nerve sheath fenestration. And if it's purely headache, ventricular periordial, VP or LP shunts and serial lumbar punctures. So let's come to the other causes. Now we're looking at a vascular. So if there's an ischemia, where you're looking at bilateral, sequential, like this patient presented, a 39-year-old, you can see the vision in the right eye dropped to 6/9. Left eye was normal, but initially he had a left eye drop of vision. Color vision was abnormal. So right now the new vent is in the right eye. But if you look at the disc, you'll see both eyes are equally edematous. There is bilateral disc edema. Though the left eye shows significant hyperemia, the effects are mostly in the right eye because left eye is now resolving. This was the visual field effects. Right eye showing severe constriction. That's a 10-2 if you can note. Left eye, on the other hand, an inferior arcuate defect with enlarged blind spot. So our differential was maybe papilledema secondary to fulminant IIH because the drop was within 4 weeks, or a bilateral NAION. But what we did was the B-scan, as I said, an important tool. We showed that there was no SAF, which you tend to see in a patient like this if there was an IIH. So confirms that this is both eyes suspected NEIN. Once you know that, as I said, an important tool, use it for ruling out even dysdrucens, as mentioned earlier. Investigate for ischemic workup to rule out any systemic risk factors, as mentioned. The lipid was only deranged but could not be seen. This was a young patient. So what was important was going ahead with a sleep study. It showed obstructive sleep apnea, and that was the cause in this young patient. There are studies that show there is significant development of NEION in patients with sleep apnea syndrome. Coming to the next one, where is a bilateral simultaneous. This happens perioperative, like an arteritic AION, which is commonly after either non-surgical cause like anemia, hypertension, or surgically after cardiac surgery or a back surgery in prone positions. Improvement is rare, no proven treatment, but try to correct whatever you could from your physician's end. Now, there's another component where you have a bilateral disc edema with unilateral loss. Like this patient, known case of diabetic for 15 years, painless loss of vision in the left eye, and the left eye, loss of vision in the right eye. It was finger counting 2 meters with the right RAPD. This is the left eye, this is a right eye disc, Left eye showed a disc which was significantly having a sectoral involvement, but the vision loss was not in the in the left eye. Hence, this was corresponding to an altitudinal defect. So what the diagnosis was, a right eye NEION with sectoral pallor, but left eye diabetic papillopathy. So you can have this. So remember, diabetic papillopathy is a diagnosis of exclusion. You have excluded other things, and the vision tends to improve, either not get affected or improve over time within 3 months. Then coming to the other causes, demyelinating optic neuropathy, that's also one. It is primarily common in children less than 12 years following a viral illness, following vaccination, not associated with MS. But now you can see it's much more common in adults, which can either occur simultaneously or in rapid succession. It's the NMO spectrum, which we see, or a MOG IgG associated disorder. The NMO spectrum shows that it's a bilateral, simultaneous or sequential, affecting significant part of the transverse myelitis. Note the refractive hiccups and vomiting, but has poor recovery. MOG, on the other hand, is the CREON, which we thought initially. It also has bilateral simultaneous, but hemorrhages are seen, and the spread is in the optic nerve sheath and the peribulbar fat, which you have to look for. MOG antibody is positive, but excellent recovery. So this is the treatment, which is more or less same, but it has to be different from your MS. Then the inflammatory or infectious part. This is a 33-year-old lady who came referred by the neurologist for the headache and tinnitus to rule out papilledema. But what was important, they had done the entire investigation, but nothing was abnormal from their end. What we noticed is in reduction to the reduced vision, we looked at the vitreous cells, which should not be missed. And as Ramesh categorically said, look at everything beyond the disc. So if you look at this red film, you look at this disc photograph, you can see the disc edema, but the red free will clearly tell you the pockets in the retina. What the patient had is multiple NSDs, and FFA confirmed that there was leak, showing that this was actually a weak AH, and the neurologist was unnecessary treatment. So definitely look at your retina, which is very, very important. And it needs to be investigated for other infectious causes, and treatment would be steroids with immunosuppressions. And finally, the others, we have to rule out other infiltrative causes like primary tumors or secondary tumors like leukemia and lymphoma. You would have the history and the physician's reports to confirm the same. So finally, to summarize, if you have an optic, bilateral optic disc edema, rule out a pseudoedema first, then a true disc edema. If there's visual loss, yes, you have to confirm that it's an optic neuropathy bilaterally and evaluate the cause. If there's no optic nerve neuropathy seen, or there is no visual loss, do an MRI, will show a structural defect or not. If there is no structural defect, yes, do a lumbar puncture and see if it's high, it's an IIH. If there's a structural defect with high pressures, you need to, and a papilledema, you confirm the same. If the ICP is normal, then you have to rule out the other causes. So to conclude, you have to take a complete history, and a thorough examination is very must. Look at appropriate tests, including your ocular, vitreous, retina, B-scan, FFA, blood tests, BP in the OPD, identify the optic neuropathy. Then you refer it to the neurology and get a neurological and neuro-ophthalmic evaluation, do a CT, MRI, MRV, MRA, whatever is necessary, LP and CSF analysis. Remember, you have to rule out papilledema in all cases of bilateral disc edema. And remember, the prognosis would be variable. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dr. Jyoti, for that excellent talk. Next, we move on to pediatric optic neuritis, and Dr. Virendra Sachdeva, who is leading the pediatric ophthalmology and neuro-ophthalmology team at the GMRV campus, LV Prasad Eye Institute, would be speaking over it. Over to you, Dr. Virendra.
Shailja, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Please start sharing
Yeah.
your screen. Yeah.
I was sharing, but there was some error. It didn't start. Did it come now?
No.
No.
I think there is some error. I might have to relog in. Maybe Murli can take the talk.
Yeah, so Dr. Muralidhar, can you start sharing your screen? And Dr. Muralidhar is a consultant at the Eye Foundation, Coimbatore. He would be speaking on ocular myasthenia gravis.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, I thank Dr. Himalini and the BOE team for having invited me for this wonderful.
There is some background music.
Yeah.
Part of your talk?
Yeah. I'll be sharing my experience with ocular myasthenia gravis. So just a brief introduction. Ocular myasthenia gravis is a disorder of the neuromuscular junction, and it is a T cell dependent B cell response. This is primarily for the postgraduates who may be attending. So it tends to be more common in young women and older men, and pure ocular myasthenia gravis, that is without any systemic involvement, seems to be commoner in older men. This is from the literature, and ptosis and diplopia is 50%. It is the initial sign in myasthenia gravis overall, including the general myasthenia gravis. Ptosis and diplopia is 50%, and eventually 90% of all myasthenia gravis develops ptosis. So that is where we come in. There is some controversy as to why the eye is so sensitive. It's possibly because the even slight weakness could cause a misalignment, and it would manifest. There could be some immunological differences between ocular and systemic muscles, possibly some anatomical physiological differences. So at present, we are not very sure as to why the eye muscles are exquisitely sensitive. So this is the general order of affliction, but there could be quite a lot of variation. Generally, I mean, you have some amount of ptosis which can be brought about. If ptosis is absent, then I would possibly rethink my diagnosis of ocular myasthenia gravis. So in the history, in particular for ptosis, we inquire about diurnal variation, or some of our patients may be having a nap in the afternoon. So if they get up and they feel quite okay and it worsens, then myasthenia gravis falls in the differential diagnosis. Remember to ask for history of systemic weakness. I'll cover in the follow-up slides as to what all you need to ask. This is very important because we deal primarily with ocular myasthenia gravis, and if there is any systemic involvement, we need to coordinate with the neurologist. So one of the foremost signs is ptosis, and this ptosis is classically fatigable. When you ask the patient to look up, so this ptosis tends to increase. Primarily for the postgraduates, I mean, there was some controversy as to how long you need to ask the patient to look up. We were traditionally taught that it is 15 seconds, but the latest edition, the 9th edition of Kansky, mentions that you have to ask the patient to look up for 45 seconds. Generally, I ask them to look up for 30 to 40 seconds before declaring a test as negative. So rapid recovery, Kogan's lid twitch sign, ask the patient to look down for, let's say, 20 to 30 seconds. This was how the patient presented to us. The left ptosis was there. We asked the patient to look down for around 20 to 30 seconds and asked him to look straight ahead. So you can see that this ptosis recovers rapidly. The lid would overshoot a little bit and then come down again. So this overshoot is said to be very typical. This is called the Kogan's lid twitch sign. These are two signs in ptosis that you need to look for. They are often positive. And orbicular is ocular involvement. This is very important, not seen very often. Sometimes it could be very subtle. But in this patient, you will see that the left eyelid closure is a tad lower than the right eyelid closure. Please note that the combination of ptosis, that is LPS, levator palpebrae superioris involvement, and orbicularis ocular involvement, happens in a very small subset of disorders, and myasthenia is the foremost of them. The other two disorders where this could happen, that is both LPS and orbicularis ocular involvement, it is myasthenia gravis and chronic progressive external ophthalmoplegia. There are three conditions where this could happen, and if it happens, myasthenia is foremost in the diagnosis. So The ice test has been talked about. So ideally, a glove bag filled with ice cubes needs to be kept in. This is the baseline ptosis that we have. So after keeping it for 2 minutes, it is 2 minutes for ptosis and 5 minutes for ophthalmoparesis. The improvement comes on rapidly, but it lasts for a very short time, 15 seconds or 20 seconds. So you have to be ready with your camera to record this. So this is another very typical feature of ocular myasthenia gravis, that is high variability that you see, and that it doesn't conform to any particular pattern. Note that this patient presents with left eye ptosis. Okay, this patient presents with initially presented with left eye ptosis. We sent him for myasthenia investigation. There is a subtle right eye elevation restriction as well. We sent him for myasthenia investigation. He was lost to follow up, and then he came back again. Now he has right eye ptosis. So this high variability, right eye ptosis and right adduction restriction and left depression restriction. So this high variability, because all these patients are usually, whenever there is a ocular motility involvement, I usually get an MRI brain with contrast also done. So MRI brain with contrast was negative, and whenever there is high suspicion of ocular myasthenia gravis, I request the radiologist also to screen for the mediastinum if there is nothing in the MRI brain. So that is covered in one shot. So MRI brain and MRI mediastinum. So MRI brain was negative in all these patients. When there is pure ptosis, I may not bother, but when there is an ocular motility restriction, even if there is something classic, I generally get at least one MRI brain with contrast with mediastinal screening. So if you see, this patient presented with left eye ptosis initially, and a subtle right eye elevation restriction, and subsequently 2-3 months later when he came, he now has a right eye ptosis. Without any treatment, he has moved from left to right eye ptosis. So this variability is very, very characteristic of ocular myasthenia gravis. So this is another very classic presentation, right eye ptosis, and when you try to elevate the right eyelid, the left eyelid droops. So this is to prove that there is bilateral ptosis. This is another patient with ocular myasthenia gravis. He presented with ptosis and with diplopia as well, with right eye elevation restriction with diplopia and left eye depression restriction. So in this, this could happen in nuclear third nerve palsy, but nuclear third nerve palsy, generally the ptosis is bilateral. And as I said, we always get an MRI brain with contrast done before, flagging it as myasthenia gravis. So this is very classic for one particular reason, that right ptosis and left inferior rectus involvement not conforming to any particular pattern. And if you notice, the ptosis is not really unilateral. So when I attempt to elevate the right eyelid, by Hering's law, the left eye starts drooping.
Dr. Murli, you have 1 minute, huh?
Yes, ma'am. So this shows us that the ptosis is bilateral. And this is another patient with bilateral ptosis, and in addition, he has a left abduction restriction. This congestion is because of a forced adduction testing. So a left abduction restriction and bilateral ptosis, again MRI negative. This is another classic patient presented with left eye ptosis, and at a subsequent visit, he had a right eye ptosis. So these are the two presentation. Eventually went on to develop a frozen globe because he was not willing for any treatment. This patient incidentally had COVID also. He recovered from COVID, and he also turned out to be positive for myasthenia gravis. All the investigations. He had a left eye ptosis, a left eye elevation restriction, and a right eye depression restriction. So right eye isolated inferior rectus palsy. This is also, should raise the suspicion of ocular myasthenia. Again, most of these patients have ptosis. So if ptosis is absent, you would question the diagnosis. There is another patient which I referred to, Dr. Ramesh Kikunia, I think would still be under his care. So this patient over a period of time during evaluation developed total right eye ptosis. So this variability in ptosis is also very typical of ocular myasthenia gravis. There is another sign.
Dr. Murli, you'll have to summarize.
Yeah, okay, ma'am. So, I would say that these are the helpful tips. So typical ptosis and extraocular muscle not strictly conforming to any particular pattern, pupil sparing, and we get this anti-musk is slightly controversial, but we usually get an RNST, single fiber EMG is no longer working, and anti-ACH receptor antibodies. And in case we have any doubt, we do a neostigmine test. And thank you so much for inviting me and listening.
Thank you, Dr. Murli.
I'll invite Dr. Virender. Shailaja, you want to introduce Dr. Virender, please? Dr. Virender, are you ready?
Yeah, I have restarted. I am just trying to share the screen again. Give me 1 second.
So meanwhile, if there is time, question to Dr. Muralidhar for his talk is how often do you have a situation where you have to start treatment of ocular myasthenia based just on clinical tests because other tests were either not available or were normal?
That's a very important question. It's a very dicey situation. I do start treatment sometimes with steroids, but the problem with steroids is that steroids work only in 90% of cases. So you have 10% non-response to steroids, and you have to give them at least 6 weeks before declaring a therapeutic test as negative. So yes, I have had that in a couple of occasions. I feel that the anti-ACH receptor antibody is a grossly underrated test. I have in my series, I've got it positive in 70%. And RNST is also quite valuable. I usually do a neostigmine test before taking them up for treatment. My threshold is that if all these tests are negative and steroids haven't worked for a month or 5 weeks, I revise my diagnosis. That's not a very happy situation because I don't know whether the patient is a steroid non-responder and whether we have to start second line therapy. Even if you involve the neurologist at this point of time, the picture tends to get more and more confused. So I give them a trial. If everything is negative, and because EMG is broken in Coimbatore and the neurologist hasn't been able to fix it, so a single fiber EMG is no longer available to us. So in that particular circumstance, if everything else is negative, I do start them on a escalating dose of oral steroids. But if there's no response at 5 weeks, I try to revise my diagnosis, review my diagnosis.
So I would like to make a comment on that. Like starting only with steroids, is it ideal? Or if you have a high clinical index of suspicion of myasthenia, would you put the patient along with pyridostigmine? And
pyridostigmine is a part of the standard thing. Pyridostigmine 60 milligram twice daily.
So is it's only with pyridostigmine?
Yeah, it's only with pyridostigmine. It's only with pyridostigmine.
So it's an empirical treatment, what you're trying with pyridostigmine and a low dose of steroid, and you would escalate the dose of steroids.
Yeah, start at 10, 20, 30, 40.
A lot of times, I think the neurologists are quite hesitant to start steroids to begin.
Yeah.
They put only on pyridostigmine. So I think we have to go back and say that, okay,
yes,
have a steroids also included in the treatment.
Yeah. So, and like how frequently you make a diagnosis in the absence of SFEMG, Dr. Murali?
Madam, SFEMG was really very valuable, but neurologist hasn't been able to retire it. So as I said, if RNST anti-ACH receptor antibody is negative, but the clinical picture is highly suggestive before starting treatment, I do a neostigmine test also with our anesthetist on standby. Now, if that is also negative and the clinical suspicion is very high, I make a note in the EMR that it's presumed ocular myasthenia gravis and I need to review the diagnosis at 5 weeks. Fortunately, it has not been that often because usually neostigmine test tends to give it away. A classic tends to give
because as you said, it becomes very difficult in the absence of ptosis. And if you're suspecting a myasthenia, because many times patients with diplopia without ptosis is not that frequent because they would develop ptosis down the line in their course of the disease process. But if they're not having a diplopia and they're presenting not having ptosis and coming only with diplopia, maybe we should also keep in mind to differentiate a thyroid eye disease also, because many a times along with ocular myasthenia gravis, because they all share the common group of autoimmune etiology, because many times myasthenia patients have been misdiagnosed as thyroid eye disease and vice versa. So always keep a suspicion for thyroid also when we see diplopia and a suspecting myasthenia without a ptosis.
In fact, they can coexist. 15%.
Yes. I had one slide actually, but for want of time.
So I think we are ready with Dr. Virendra's talk.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, Dr. Virendra.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry for some error. I think it's some unknown error. I couldn't do it myself. I requested Dr. Ramesh to share the screen. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramesh. Thanks, Dr. Hemalini and BOA. So coming to pediatric optic neuritis, I think it is one of the most important conditions that we see in neuro-ophthalmology clinics, especially even in pediatric age group also. We all know that optic neuritis is inflammation of the optic nerve, and it could take the form of a retrobulbar involvement where the disc does appear normal, or there could be involvement of the optic nerve with the swelling of only optic nerve, which is papillitis, or swelling extending beyond into the posterior pole, which mimics like a neuroretinitis. We are primarily dealing with a demyelinating disease, and neuroretinitis rules out the possibility of a demyelinating disease. Coming to the pathogenesis, it is primarily a demyelination, which actually occurs due to the inflammatory pathology, and there are many demyelinating conditions that will come across. So the demyelination process actually leads to the loss of the normal conduction. We can see in the animation that on the top there is a normal saltatory conduction, whereas in the presence of demyelination it stops at the level of the demyelination, and depending on severity it might be total loss of the conduction. So let's see a few examples that we typically see in pediatric age group with optic neuritis. This is the first case of a 7-year-old boy who presented to us with acute onset decrease in vision for distance and near for last 4 days. There was pain on eye movements, and there was history of febrile illness and rhinitis, but there were no other significant neurologic or systemic complaints. Visual acuity was hand movements, accurate projection of rays in the right eye, and left eye was 20/20. There was grade 3 RAPD in the right eye, but rest of the anterior segment was normal. Coming to the fundus picture, the left eye appeared normal, normal retina and the normal optic nerve. And in the right eye, while the rest of the retina was normal, there was disc hyperemia along with disc swelling and edema of the peripapillary RNFL. So with this, we are thinking of possibility of right eye papillitis, and the OCT confirmed the involvement of the swelling of the right optic nerve while the left eye was normal. We did the visual fields, and the right eye visual fields were not possible, but left eye showed minimal depression of the foveal sensitivity along with few depressed central points in the left eye. We proceeded and did the neuroimaging of the patient, which showed presence of the swelling, increased thickness, and enhancement of the right optic nerve, which was seen on both axial as well as coronal views. And in addition, we can see that there is significant pansinusitis on both sides, but this gives us a clue that possibly with history of febrile illness, rhinitis, pain on eye movements, and acute vision loss, it's a para-infectious optic neuritis. The patient was treated with IVMP under cover of antibiotics to take care of sinusitis as well, followed by oral steroids as per ONTT protocol. And there was good recovery of the visual function. We can see that at 1 month, patient had 20/25 visual acuity with mild temporal pallor, and left eye was appearing quite normal. And at 9 months follow-up, again, very similar presentation with good visual function, but pallor of right eye, and maybe a very subtle pallor in the left eye. The visual fields at this time showed good recovery of visual fields in right eye, but both eyes show a minimal foveal sensitivity depression and mild depression on the pattern deviation plots, suggesting possibly left eye was also slightly involved. This is a common scenario where the patients recover very well after a para-infectious optic neuritis. Another not uncommon condition that we see in pediatric age group is a subclinical optic neuritis. This is a case of a 13-year-old girl who presented to us with blurred vision for 5 days. The blurring of vision was in both eyes. There was no preceding illness. Anterior segment was normal, no RAPD. BCA was only slightly reduced to 20/30 in both eyes, and color vision was slightly reduced. Especially the low contrast visual acuity were reduced in both eyes to 20/80. Visual fields of patient showed central scotoma in both eyes, and the VEP showed actually prolonged P100 implicit times and subnormal amplitudes in both eyes, as can be seen in this VEP. So we made a diagnosis of subclinical optic neuritis, and this patient MRI was actually normal, and the patient did have good recovery over a period of time. Coming to the third scenario, this is possibly one of the most common scenarios that we are coming across nowadays. This is a child, 9-year-old girl, who presented to us with decrease in vision in left eye for 2 days. There was history of recent onset seizures, first episode occurring 2 months prior. The patient was under care of a neurologist. Best corrected visual acuity in right eye was 20/20 and counting finger 2 meters in left eye. Fundus examination was normal in right eye, but there was presence of disc edema along with disc hyperemia in the left eye. Rest of the retina was normal in both eyes. So we were thinking of optic neuritis. The MRI brain and orbits with contrast showed only mild thickening of the right optic nerve. Rest of the brain parenchyma was normal. And the patient was treated with IVMP as per ONTT, and there was good recovery of the visual function. However, 1 month later, the patient came back with involvement of the right eye. There was decrease in vision in right eye of 1 day duration. Visual acuity had reduced to 2400 in right eye. Left eye was 2020. There was disc edema in right eye at this point of time, and there was very subtle temporal pallor in the left eye, which was evident. So we did a repeat imaging, which showed presence of optic nerve swelling along with enhancement on the post-contrast images, as well as the other MRI features of the brain parenchyma in this patient. Dr. Ramesh, can you move to the next slide? Okay, so they were showing few hyperintense lesions. I do not have that slide here. Maybe it's the next one. So joining the links, this patient actually had new onset seizures few months before, recurrent optic neuritis, and then we proceeded to work up for the demyelinating diseases. So we did serum NMO antibodies and MOG antibodies, and the patient was positive for MOG antibodies. Therefore, we finally made the diagnosis of myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein associated demyelinating disease. This is actually the MRI of another patient who had very similar presentation, and we can see there were large T2 as well as flare hyperintense lesions which were seen in this patient, which were actually involving even the optic tract as well as the white matter areas. So this patient also was a MOG antibody positive optic neuritis. So this ADEM-like presentation is quite common with MOG optic neuritis. To summarize, these patients can have bilateral or sequential involvement. They have good response to steroids, and recurrences are quite common. They can have associated myelitis and encephalitis, and they can have ADEM-like features on neuroimaging. In our very little, Dr. Ramesh, next slide, please. In our very little experience, we have seen about 12 patients over last 2 years, and the age group is not much different from other patients. We have observed that about 50% of them do have some other neurological symptoms like syncopal attacks, seizures, or ataxia. Optic nerve involvement is frequently bilateral, and they do present to us at the first episode, and it can be difficult to distinguish from a post-infectious optic neuritis. Next slide, Dr. Ramesh. So to summarize, optic neuritis in children could be a clinically isolated syndrome, which can also be part of para-infectious or post-vaccination. However, it could be more commonly associated with CNS or systemic disease. They can be MS, ADEM, NMO, or the most frequently reported one is MOG antibody associated demyelination. The next slide, please. In the recently concluded prospective pediatric optic neuritis study, they observed that isolated optic neuritis was observed in 48%, while among the demyelinating diseases, MOG antibody associated optic neuritis was the most common. Others were MS, ADEM, and NMO. And these patients can have actually worse visual acuity outcome if they're associated with demyelination. But it is very important to distinguish between them because—
Okay, Virender, may I request you to summarize, please?
Yeah, just 2 slides, I think. They can have different outcomes because of the recurrences commonly associated with NMO and MS, and they can have progressive neurological deficit. Next slide, please. To summarize, in adult versus pediatric optic neuritis, there can be pediatric optic neuritis usually has bilateral involvement. It could be following up prior viral illness or vaccination. Papillitis is common. There is not a female preponderance in the younger children, and these patients can have association with marked vision loss at the time of presentation. They are less frequently associated with MS, but more frequently associated with MOG antibody associated optic neuritis. The goals of workup are to characterize visual function and to define the associated diseases. So neuroimaging as well as serological workup is very important, and MRI is possibly the most important investigation, which also gives us clues to the likely etiology. Dr. Ramesh, can you just project the next slide next to this? And this slide tells how the MRI can give us very important clues. In multiple sclerosis, there is usually unilateral involvement and involvement of the anterolateral columns and the pericallosal brain involvement. Whereas in NMO, there can be bilateral involvement, chiasm involvement, as well as involvement of the central spinal canal, which is usually in the thoracic spine. MOG can also be bilateral. There can be long segments involvement, but usually in the caudal areas of the spinal cord. And there can be area postrema involvement. So with this, we can develop a neuroimaging can give us good clues how to think, and then we can guide our serological workup and CSF analysis. I think in interest of time, we can just go to the conclusion slide. Yeah, one slide. So it is not an uncommon disease. It's quite common to have optic neuritis even in pediatric age group. We have to be aware of the presentation. Some of the features like bilateral involvement papillitis are frequent. Subclinical forms are not uncommon. Although the initial treatment can be guided by the ONTT, but we should obtain a definite imaging and workup and then guide treatment according to the etiology. Thank you very much for a patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Brinder. Yeah, so I think we have already exceeded time, but Dr. Hemalini has allowed 5 more minutes because this is a lunch time that we're extending. We'd have a quick couple of questions. First one is for Dr. Jyoti Matalia. What are the clinical guides and what are the questions or what are the suspicions for the sleep apnea syndrome if you suspect in a patient with NAIN, and how would you go ahead with investigating them further?
Okay, so now what I have noticed in my practice is a lot of young patients who are coming with sudden loss of vision, and you're getting bilaterally features of NAIN on the fundus have to be investigated. So when they have ruled out anything systematic, like there's no diabetes, no blood pressure, and I show the systematic workup. So any cause that can be an ischemic workup done, like you do the CBC, ESR, you do serum homocysteine, you do the lipid profile, the carotid Doppler. So anything that can be an ischemic cause to that is worked up. And then at the end, if you feel that this is not fitting in, there has to be a strong reason for the patient to have bilateral disc edemas with, susceptible of NAIN. And in those cases, then if I don't have, I go ahead for a sleep apnea. Yes, we can do it. But in my place where we do it, it's pretty expensive. So many a times when we give the whole list of things to do, a lot of them refuse to do that. I think Dr. Ambika wanted to say something.
I think, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the questions that you can ask when you're suspecting a sleep apnea, one is whether a patient snores every day. Second, whether he's drowsy through the day, whether he sleeps in the day, whether he's drowsy through the day, whether he feels tired when he wakes up in the morning, when you are suspecting sleep apnea. And I had curiously had a patient who was actually monitoring his oxygen on Apple Watch, and he found that consistently it was 85, 86, 87 during his sleep, which gives you a clue that maybe he's not getting enough oxygen during the sleep.
Just to add that rather than asking the patient, ask the person who sleeps with him. So many times
they say, no, say that. Ask the wife.
Yes. The males always refuse. They say, no, I don't snore. So the person who's with him will say, yes, you do. Yes, so I think Dr. Ambika wanted to say something.
OSAS is quite an underestimated cause. It's very, very common and we often neglect it.
How's the husband also?
I have a question to Dr. Jyoti. Jyoti, did you make a diagnosis of bilateral NAION? Did the patient come with a bilateral drop in vision?
Yes.
With a NAION-like picture?
Yes, so the same case I showed, incidentally, the patient was not from Bangalore. So by the time he came with the loss of vision in one eye, and then he was traveling from Bihar. So by the time he came in and I saw him.
So
yes, it's not the simultaneous, it's sequential, yes. So he came with the loss of vision in one eye. By the time he reached, he said, now my left eye is doing a little better, but my right eye is worse. And if you see the picture-wise, the left eye had more significant edema compared to right eye, but the drop in vision was more in the right eye. So it was a sequential.
And one more doubt is, was the patient having a profile of a prone for OSA?
Yes, he had. Then when I looked at him, his body structure and all was very typically, they have these like a little obese, then the chest was like full. So when we referred him to our pulmonologist, then they asked him to go ahead and do the study, which came positive. So looking at that thing, he did have a...
So and then profile will make a difference when we ask for an OSA, because not all the young patients, because most of our young patients, when they come with this sequential loss, you have to look into all other differentials before giving OSA as a reason for the ischemic event, because that's what I said. We see a lot of young patients coming with headache. They may be hypertensives because we see a lot of young hypertensives now. So hypertension is one, because these are more common which we would come across. Agreed for OSA. But number two is increased incidence of venous sinus thrombosis also is happening. So venous sinus thrombosis, because a couple of patients during this lockdown, we saw that they were being diagnosed elsewhere as NaION because they started having diffuse disc edema, unlike your patient where it had a sectoral disc edema. If the patient has a sectoral NaION-like picture, it will help us to make the diagnosis. But when we come up with this diffuse disc edema, and when they make the diagnosis of ischemic optic neuropathy, unfortunately, this fellow, he lost his vision. He had an extensive superior sagittal sinus thrombosis, and he had a cerebral venous sinus thrombosis as the cause for the disc edema, which lost the vision. And it was a progressive event. So when this young patients come, when we make this diagnosis of OSA, we have to be very careful. Like as your patient was rightly fitting in the profile of OSA, when we have non-profile OSA patients, we have to be careful when we make that diagnosis. And you also have to screen for buried optic disc drusen in all these patients, young patients coming with NaION.
Right. Yes, nowadays, a lot of disc drusen patients in
Thank you,
young
ma'am.
is another
Point well
cause
taken.
for
The
developing.
last question to Dr. Ramesh, and maybe others can also chip in. Now, very often there is a scenario when a patient comes with a history of vision loss, or in fact, sometimes children come with just unilateral optic atrophy, and prior neuroimaging has been normal. Okay, so now when the patient has been coming to you, how often do you end up doing another repeat imaging, or do you rely, or where are there other clinical features? Because children usually don't complain that, the visual acuity is completely falling, or, progressive loss. So there's often this dilemma in the clinic. So Dr. Ramesh, if you could answer, and maybe others can chip in.
Yeah, just to frame your question, it's like unilateral optic atrophy. Patient is just imaged before. There are few things I will really roll out, Shailja. Number one, history. I would really think about trauma this patient had or not. Second thing is morphology, as I alluded to, all the things. There also, I don't have a clue means I will do the other eye visual field. Then if there is anything on the other side, probably I will, for example, there is a hemianopic field, then it becomes very clear to us. If there is no associated retinal, there is no other eye involvement, I would really look at the MRI. There are two situations. MRI is done, one paper is there, MRI is normal. That's number one situation. Number two situation is MRI is done, report is available, plates are available. These plates are just two old things that are already rusted. If I don't get what I want really, there are things like MRI done, no cuts available, no contrast. Then I would really repeat. These kind of situations, I don't know about others, I would say almost 40 to 50% of the situations are like this, Shailja, in our practice. Either it's inadequate, either it is what I want, I really don't see. But the decision what I'll make is, if it is traumatic, I'm convinced that it's a traumatic optic neuropathy, I will not go for it. I know that there is nothing else, but I can't explain this optic atrophy. Either it is, hereditary or nutritional. I would really chase that why it is happening. And unilateral, I would not think too much about the brain. If it is unilateral, I think it's somewhere around the orbit. My focus will be too much on that, or sometimes it can be, abaxial pituitary tumors also. So I would repeat based on that. Unilateral or bilateral visual field findings really will guide me in these kind of situations.
Yeah, Dr. Gandhi and Dr. Ambika, Dr. Sachdeva, any last comments before we wrap up?
Ramesh if you are not able to explain why patient is having optic atrophy, and if you don't have the scan which you require, patient has done only CT scan. Now that's not enough to explain any soft tissue lesion, or patient does not have contrast, as Ramesh mentioned, same points.
See, my take is, if the child has come with an optic disc pallor, the vision recovered or not. If the vision is recovered, uniocular pale disc, I will not go probing it beyond. Whenever the vision has not recovered, or if the fellow eye is showing some changes, and if the sections are inadequate and being CT done. So if there is a CT, one eye optic disc pallor, other eye is also evolving into a neuropathy, don't wait. Go ahead and image. Probably you may be missing a subclinical optic neuritis. And I default ask always for a brain and orbit, even if there is a uniocular optic disc pallor. So sometimes we may be missing a subtle brain changes like demyelinating, like edem or any other in a child, which would have come and gone unnoticed. Because in children, if they are having bilateral vision loss, parents will bring. If it is monocular vision loss, it is invariably during an accidental evaluation, we pick it up. So
Yeah.
better image.
Yeah. Dr. Padmavati, would you like to add something? You need to unmute yourself, ma'am.
Yes, I think Ambika has given a valid point in that. Usually whenever usually the patients outside practitioners always advise a CT brain, but basically they come with the CT brain. But when you are not convinced with the imaging and the clinical history, repeat imaging is always mandatory. That is what I also will go with the a question I think I have for Dr. Virendra. Do you go for MOG and NMO in pediatric age group routinely?
Dr. Padmavati, thank you for that question. I think it's a very valid question at this point of time. Given the profile, like what I was trying to say, that whatever patients we have observed, they are not clinically different from patients who have post-infectious kind of presentation. So with this, I think it is very important to get it done for majority of patients if they can afford. So we do.
Economic constraint is the major one because most of the pediatric, they fit into the ADM type of presentation. Most of them. Because
ADM-like presentation we should definitely do, because ADM-like, there are a few studies which are telling clinically what are the differences. There is a very nice study by Dr. Hackwan's group in UK, which tells that if you look at the presentation wise, patients who have MS, they're likely to be older, female predominance, and will never have ADM-like presentation. Same thing applies for clinically isolated syndrome. In patients who are having transverse myelitis, that is highly specific towards NMO, and patients who are having MOG-like presentation, in them ADM-like presentation is very much likely. So this is our observation also with little experience of these patients, that ADM-like presentation, majority of them did fit into MOG-like presentation, and if the steroids were not started early, or they were tapered off quite quickly without giving any immunosuppression, they had recurrences. So
I think in India for neuro-ophthalmology, there is always a division between considering the economics. I would not say only in India, even in some of the countries. One is what is ideal and what we should do. So if you can't do ideal investigations, because I don't know about others, everybody wants within 10 minutes the diagnosis. Sir, what is this optic neuritis? It'll come back or what? This is not possible in neuro-ophthalmology. So if I can't do the ideal investigations, I will probe and I'll go deeper into the neurological examination. I will call the patient very frequently. I will ask history of hiccups, seizures, all that, which can corroborate with between NMO, MOG, all that. This is the major problem, I think, in most of the neuro-ophthalmology practice, what we do here. So I think if you can't do ideal test, but don't ignore the clinical signs and clues. This is what I would take in most of the patients. Thank you.
Dr. Ambika, you want to add something?
Yeah, Dr. Padma, I feel that we are having a group of patients who are presenting to us without neurological features also. ADEM, clear-cut, we are going to get all these spectrum antibodies. If you are going to have isolated pediatric optic neuritis, then would you do this antibodies or not is your question. Probably more you are interested in knowing that. I would suggest please ask for these antibodies, because we don't know which group of these children are going to fall into the recurrent neuritis, recurrent attacks when you are tapering down the steroid. Because when you have come down on steroids, these children can fall back with recurrent attacks. And for children, the role of immunosuppression is still a gray area, particularly less than 8 and 9 and all, they don't go to the next level. If your first attack itself, if the child was MOG positive, I caution the parents that the child will require a chronic immunosuppression. So even though when you come down on steroids, watch, there can be a possible recurrence, because our Indian tendency is once given the treatment, we expect it is end of the chapter, particularly when it comes with a child. So when the child is not able to tell, you please ask for the antibody, because the same child can land up in some other clinic with a recurrence. But if you have put a tag that it's a mock positive first attack, that clinician will know that it requires a long-term immunosuppression. So please ask, with or without ADEM, ask for the antibodies, because our literature is still very poor in this category. We don't know how our group of patients are behaving.
NMO, I think, would be distinct, uncommon in children, no, madam?
Yeah, still it is not come up, not only in adults, even in adults, it is very less, but we don't have our own database. So without knowing that, we don't know. So MOG is more common. We can hypothesize.
Have you seen a surge in pediatric optic neuritis in this post-COVID era?
You're asking me?
I'm asking, no, everyone only, anyone, because our plate, I'm seeing at least every week 1 or 2 cases of pediatric optic neuritis. That is why I had a doubt.
Okay.
We have not seen any increase. It's the same.
Okay, great.
Ma'am, actually, we also thought that this is probably increasing. So what we did is compared 3 months data. This was last COVID lockdown time. We compared the 2019 data with 2020 and saw that it's the same. It's just that the routine patients are less. So we think that, these patients are more in proportion. So the number of cases.
Maybe we are biased by the COVID.
Yeah, it was similar. Even for cranial nerve palsies were kind of similar, the number of patients.
Even the patients.
Only the COVID patients are coming out of the house, I think.
Yeah.
Other patients are not coming out.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, we don't know.
Teresa, we'll wind up.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
We've gone into the lunchtime also.
Okay.
So thank you everyone
Okay.
for participating and initiating this lovely discussion and superb talks. Thank you again and see you soon.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
For making
Take care. Stay
Bye.
safe.
Bye. Take care.